Once again, a nation once again.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Independent Activist YouTube channel. My name's Fra Hughes. I'm a journalist and author, and I live in Belfast, and I'm also Director of Palestine Aid, a registered charity. The reason for the podcast is to try and disseminate the truth to as wide an audience as possible. I am an anti-imperialist by my politics, anti-colonial, anti-capitalist. I think it's important that we have alternative media sources to try and stop the propaganda from the mainstream media brainwashing everyone. So please subscribe and share the channel to help build an audience going forward. And if there's any topics that you'd like us to cover here on the Independent Activist, you can email me, frahughes51@gmail.com, and you'll find all these details in the description below. Thank you very much.
Okay, everyone, I'd like to welcome you to the latest episode of The Independent Activist. My name's Fra Hughes, and I live in Belfast, and I'm Director of Palestine Aid, a registered charity. And tonight, I'd like to welcome Batool Subeti, who is an activist and a political analyst, originally from Lebanon. And that's going to be the topic of the subject of conversation for tonight. We're going to talk historically about how Lebanon came to be as a nation state, the challenges that set. Then we're going to go on to talk about maybe why the PLO was in Lebanon at one stage, how the resistance was born, and how that came into being. The two national wars of liberation that were fought in Lebanon. Then we'll bring things up to date into the latest Israeli incursions to include the ceasefire between Lebanon and the Zionist state. And then, importantly, going forward, we'll talk about President Aoun and the new Prime Minister. So, Batool, thank you very much for agreeing to come on the show. I've seen you on Press TV. I know you write for Al Madin, and I've seen you on several of the British television stations that cover West Asia and everything that's happening there. So if we stay with the timeline, uh, I know enough about history in West Asia to know that I don't know everything, and I don't really know enough about everything that's going on. But could you tell us how Lebanon came to be? What was before Lebanon? How it came about? I don't know if it's Sykes-Picot or something that came after that. And what challenges did that set then for what could be considered as an artificial state created specifically to have its own internal contradictions from the very start?
Right, yeah. So you've mentioned Sykes-Picot. Firstly, thank you so much for having me. It's my absolute honor. Yeah, so you've mentioned Sykes-Picot. I think if we just take a little bit of a step back before that. So Lebanon, or specifically Mount Lebanon, is what people would identify as Lebanon, is that region within the heart of it, which consists of mainly Druze and Christians back in the 17th century. Now, after around, I think it was 1861, there existed the autonomous Mount Lebanon region, and it had a Christian governor. And that had been created as a homeland for the Maronite Christian sect within Lebanon, and it was under European orders. So the Maronites of Lebanon had relations with the French, the Druze had relations with the British, and so actually it was the Maronite Catholics and the Druze who founded modern Lebanon in the early around 18th century. And they had independence from the Ottoman rule. So they were, if you like, in modern day terms, considered as like a kind of local authority. So Mount Lebanon is what formed the main backbone of the Lebanese state. And then you had areas like Beirut in the north, you had, Jebel Amel in the south, that were then forged into the whole of Lebanon as we know today. So Lebanon, in historic terms, I'm sure you'd be aware of this, and your viewers probably as well, was a part of Greater Syria until the Ottoman Empire's demise. And so this is where we go on to Sykes-Picot, which was following World War One. The League of Nations mandate partitioning effectively Ottoman Syria under French control, which eventually led to the creation of the nation states of Lebanon and Syria. So you had a kind of Mount Lebanon that existed historically. It was independent from the Ottomans, but then you had that kind of de facto separation between the two in the wake of World War One, with the ascension of the Allied powers and their victory. So Sykes-Picot is effectively what paved the way for this and allowed that region to be split between the British and the French influence. And so in Lebanon, you had about 23 years of French colonial mandate rule. And I believe it came to an end in the early 1940s. I think it was 1943. And so there was a kind of like potentiality for figures and movements to exist that opposed colonial French presence in that region, especially in the early 20th century. But the reality is that those leaders that belonged to such movements, they didn't really have much strength or awareness or abilities to actualize their aims. So that led that even such leaders of those movements, that led them to be under the reign and under the direction of the West. So once you had movements that were opposed to colonialism, their opposition carried a kind of scent of their colonizers. And so a prominent example in Lebanon would be a man called Riyad al-Solih. Riyad al-Solih was the first Lebanese PM post-independence. He was actually sentenced to death, I believe, in about 1920 because he rejected France's creation of a Greater Lebanon. But then this was a punishment that he was later commuted to exile, and then he returned to Greater Lebanon in around 1924 and was exiled again because he participated in the unsuccessful Great Syrian Revolt, which happened from 1925 until 1927, which was basically when you had a group of Arab nationalists across what was known as Mandatory Lebanon and Syria, and they sought to rid themselves from French rule. There's an author called William Harris. He authored a book in, I think it was around 2012. It's called Lebanon History from 600 to 2011, where he makes the argument basically that Riyad al-Solih was someone who didn't abandon the goal of like this big Arab state, but he was a pragmatist. So on pragmatic grounds, he ended up promoting like France's vision of a great Lebanon, that he held kind of conservative notions of independence, and there was a kind of coexistence with colonial powers without total subjugation. So that was the kind of model that you're talking about in Lebanon. This was the nature of the leaders who actually led the liberation movement, which explains why Lebanon never ended up really, truly becoming liberated from the shackles of the West. So you had this man, Riyad al-Solih, who was the PM of Lebanon. You had Bishar al-Khoury, who was the first post-independence president of Lebanon. So they implemented what was known as the National Pact in 1943, which basically provided this kind of framework that could accommodate the confessional differences in Lebanon, as you mentioned in your intro. So it was really France that laid that foundation for Lebanon as a multi-confessional state that ran along sectarian lines. And they were the ones who promoted individuals to power who they deemed fit to serve their interests. So right from the start, there was a kind of like real discrimination where the majority of the positions of power belonged to Maronite Christians first, followed by Sunni Muslims, and then followed by Shias, despite the majority of the population being in reverse. So you had major economic disparities and inequalities within Lebanon at the time that eventually led to the civil war in the 70s. But we can already see from here that the independence, quote unquote, took on a face whereby the nature of the influence and the control changed really from direct occupations to individuals in power who are linked to independence. But you have a structure in which it is built on colonialism, and that is where the power is emanating from. And you see that until today in Lebanon, especially amongst the Maronite population. They have quite an emotional relationship with France still. It's like they view it as like the caring, abusive mother. But the reality is that the people of Lebanon, even within 2020, when Macron came to visit Lebanon in the wake of the Beirut port explosion, they sought refuge in him. There was one woman who went viral for like crying to Macron, explaining the issues of Lebanon, and him telling her, like comforting her and saying that like we'll fix it for you. It's like the saviors that have come 100 years later to Lebanon to fix the situation when they are the root cause. It's the colonialism that's the issue. So these people in Lebanon tend to find themselves drawn to him by all of their existence, and have really kind of demonstrated that psychological colonial mentality where you have like the colonized that is internalizing and believing in the colonial power's superiority, and even going to the extent of enjoying the act of submission. It's bizarre. But none of this is taking away from the reality of that occupier who has nothing to offer, but empty talks at best, and at worst, sanctioning and demonization and aggression, because France until now keeps Lebanon in close demand. So you see when Macron came to Lebanon in 2020 with demands, he was speaking in a way as though France would like once again be victorious in like shaping Lebanon's system of governance, which still exists according to the French colonial lines. And like the operation that Macron sought to put forward in Lebanon was to support it. Even the way that he wanted to support it, it was like through the World Bank, through the IMF, through the general reforms, which are all, just as we know very well, expressions for keeping Lebanon hostage to the aggressive world capitalist system that imposes its political conditions, that imposes its agendas, and is the reason that Lebanon today is under the worst maximum pressure sanctions that Trump imposed in 2019 that led to the worst inflation that humanity has ever seen. So the freedom of 1943, the independence of 1943, didn't mean independence in like the true sense. It meant independence really by name, but it's quite similar to the situation of the Arabs today, where you have like, these, supposed independent Arab countries, but ultimately it's the American pressures that push them and lead them and take them in all kinds of directions.
Yeah, I would describe it as kind of a post-colonial occupation. You mentioned an occupation of the mind, and that's what you have in an oppressed people when they are told that they're not told they're inferior. They're told that their occupiers are superior to them. They have a better culture. They have a better democratic system. They value human rights. They're there for I mean, like the British Empire would have told all the people who were subjected under their military and financial and corporate occupation that you are a British citizen. The Queen is your Queen. You have the same rights as everyone in Britain. It's exactly what they've done in Lebanon to say, you are French by extension. We will always be here. Macron came across as an emperor, the way you were describing him there. I think that very much fits his own psychology. And I think the post-colonial financial occupation, which has replaced the military occupation, I mean, perfect examples of that are the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. So they target a country economically through the sanctions. They then come along and say, well, we'll give you 20 billion or 50 billion or 100 billion, but you must privatize your health service. You must privatize education. You must sell us your energy production systems, your utilities around water, oil, fuel, electricity. So they come back in and they reoccupy the country through the financial streams that run the economy. So maybe you could bring us up to, it's maybe not something that people should or want to talk about, but the Civil War, how it came about, what were the contradictions, how did we end up in a position where you had a fractured society then fighting each other, and to whose benefit was that civil war, and were there outside instigators provoking and promoting sectarianism for their own political agenda?
Right, of course. It was the economic disparities at that time, as I described, that multi-confessional system in Lebanon created a situation where you had the Christians in, strong and well-off positions of power, and the Muslim, particularly the Shias, were in downtrodden conditions, working very poor manual labor jobs. So in that situation, it was almost like the French purposefully created a system of contradictions where it was a ticking time bomb, and it was inevitable that a civil war was going to break out. And the proof of how deep the tensions were running is the fact that that civil war lasted for a good 15 years. It lasted from 1975 until about 1990. And the West knew exactly what it was doing, because prior to the Civil War, yes, despite Lebanon coming out of its post-colonial era, Lebanon still had independence in the sense that it had its own functioning economy, it had its own industries, it could manufacture its own products. It wasn't very now. Lebanon doesn't import anything. Lebanon, sorry, doesn't export anything, or Lebanon doesn't sort of produce anything that is self-sufficient. It has to import everything. It's a very strong import-based economy, even on the level of, I don't know if you want to call it toothpaste or toothbrush, or just on that very minimal level of home equipment. And that is due to the dependence that Lebanon was put under post the Civil War, where individuals, billionaire tycoons like Rafiq al-Hariri, was brought into positions of power again by the West, and he debt trapped Lebanon through the institutions that you were mentioning, like the IMF, where he forced post-reconstruction on Lebanon. So, they borrowed millions and millions, tens of millions from, these kinds of institutions. And Lebanon was never able to repay it. And as you would know as well, the lira was pegged to the dollar for the longest time. So this was for about a good 30 years until 2019, when the maximum pressures came in and you saw the hyperinflation go up when that American support was removed. So ultimately, it was almost like by design, the West wanted it to get to a place in Lebanon where there would be this ticking time bomb, which would eventually explode. There'd be a civil war, and that would then be their opportunity to, shift Lebanon into the new phase or era that they wanted. Now, of course, it was a very complicated 15 years because it coincided with the Israeli invasion of Lebanon, in which you had the resistance movement that was born out of that invasion. Of course, it was a time in which you also had the PLO that shifted from Jordan to Lebanon. So, of course, you had the displaced Palestinians who were forced to flee in the wake of 1948 Nakba due to the massacres that were taking place in Palestine. But the Palestinians had no kind of movement or military presence from 1948 until around the 1970s. But that was initially in Jordan. So in 1966, you had Fatah, the PLO that was led by Yasser Arafat, that would conduct operations, against 1948 occupied territories from there. So, for example, they do things like guerrilla landmine attacks, killing Israeli occupation soldiers on border patrols. And as we would know, Jordan is this kind of monarchy that's installed by the British, and was considered, and Jordan was in fact considered that buffer zone between the occupied 1948 territories and the Arab countries. And so you had battles that really took place in Jordan against the PLO, in which they raided their camps. So there was one battle called the Battle of Karame that happened in 1968, for example, that targeted the PLO across the Karama camp in the Jordan River. And then you had the Black September in 1970 that happened, where there was like an armed conflict, I think, where King Hussein was the one who basically targeted the PLO and eventually expelled them. So they were expelled into Lebanon. And at that point, when the PLO were expelled to Lebanon, as we're describing, is weak, is plagued with sectarianism, and the Palestinians ultimately managed to integrate themselves within the Muslims. And they began leading operations against 1948 occupied Palestine from Lebanon. And they got stronger. And then ultimately in 1974, that's when the Civil War happened. And within the American strategy, the PLO also couldn't enter the Christian or the Maronite areas. And Syria at that time was also careful about this balance too. Syria sought to protect the Christians as well. But we know that also Syria wanted some kind of presence in Lebanon. So here you have Israel in Lebanon now, Syria in Lebanon now during the course of the 70s. Syria intervened in Lebanon in around 1976. And the PLO got stronger in the south within the Civil War. And Israel did its limited invasions into Lebanon, such as in 1978, until in 1982, when it decided that it wanted to reach Beirut. But by then, the PLO had become, completely hollow, corrupt. Interests got involved. Gulf money came in. And of course, the Gulfs and their interests, they didn't want the Palestinians to be used against them and their corrupt rule. And by then, the Palestinians, or the PLO, had much, much less morale. So the PLO was extinguished by then and moved to Tunisia. And as we know, the rest is history. And at present, we know it went down the road of normalization. But ultimately, the Israelis at that point brought Bashir al-Jumayr to power as president, who was the Lebanese militia commander who led the Lebanese forces during the Civil War, which was the military wing of the Kataib Party. So just the fact that Israel managed to reach the heart of Beirut in 1982 tells you the extent to which Lebanon was weak, was fragmented, and was really prey to external parties, specifically the West here, who created the conditions for the infighting, and then, of course, these socioeconomic conditions. And then that is what enabled Israel ultimately to go in and invade using the pretext of the PLO, because the PLO left by 1982, but the Israeli occupation and invasion, when they were forced to unilaterally withdraw, that was in 2000, because of course their aims and their goals were Greater Israel. So the West is notorious in this. It creates ticking time bombs so that these wars can happen, and they take advantage and they exploit these wars. So ultimately, at the end of the Civil War, Lebanon was kind of converted into a situation where the economic system of power and the structure was completely beholden to the IMF, so that Lebanon, specifically the resistance in Lebanon, can be pressured as and when the West wants. When I say the resistance in Lebanon, I mean the people of Lebanon will suffer the worst kinds of economic sanctions so that they can forego the resistance. Same concept and strategy that we're seeing used against the Islamic Republic of Iran, that's been used against Syria under Bashar al-Assad. And that's to ultimately create a separation between the people and the entities that they want to target. And so Mike Pompeo came out in 2019 and said this very clearly, to the Lebanese people, if you want us to reinstate our support back to the Lebanese economy, which we rigged in the first place by pegging the lira to the dollar, you never find in any real functioning economy that the currency remains fixed and it doesn't fluctuate. You've had it pegged for the longest time. $1 is equal to, I think, about 2014 Lebanese pounds. That's not normal. And Lebanon being in a situation where It is completely beholden to imports. It doesn't manufacture any of its own. It's just relying mainly on two sources, which is tourism, and it's relying on its expats as well. It's expats to bring in money into the country. So Lebanon was put in a position where it was completely broken on purpose.
Yeah, it's the classic imperialist divide and rule, isn't it? Trying to separate the people, trying to find whatever wedge they can put into general society to have people fighting each other and not fighting the oppressor, be that financially, economically, militarily, or politically. I found it very interesting what you were saying there about the Civil War and how that came about. I remember 1982. I was 19 years of age in Belfast, and there was a national war of liberation going on against the British occupation here. And we had a mural, which I believe still exists in West Belfast, where it showed one man in a combat uniform with a balaclava and one man in a combat uniform with a keffiyeh, and they both held their arms up, and it was like a rocket propelled grenade, an RPG, and they were both holding onto this RPG, and it said something like two armies, one struggle, the universal cause of anti-colonialism. And I remember at the time the murders in Shabra and Shatia, and I was able to visit both Shabra and Shatia, the camps, in 2011 when I was at the American University Viva Palestina uh, summer camp in 2011 with George Galloway, Ronnie Castro's, Leila Khalid, and a lot of people who had been on the convoy along with me in 2010, Viva Palestina 5, that went to Gaza. If we could maybe come forward in time, now, Hezbollah didn't exist prior to the 1980s. So the question is, why did it come into being? Why does it exist? Well, could we claim? I mean, the PLO existed because the Zionists stole the land of the Palestinians, and they were involved in a national war of liberation. So can we claim something similar for Hezbollah in that if there hadn't have been the Zionist occupation of southern Lebanon up to and including Beirut in 1982, would Hezbollah even exist? And if you could bring that forward to how it became so entrenched within Lebanese society, because it's not just a military force fighting for liberation, it's also a political force, it's a charitable force, and it works within Lebanese society. And I've tried extremely hard to try and work against the sanctions and to help bring in fuel and help with electricity and help with food for the most disadvantaged people of all sects and all religions and all political affiliations within Lebanon. So if you could maybe try and tie that up for us as to why they exist and how they came into being.
Absolutely. So I'll start off by saying that resistance is an idea rooted in deep faith, conviction. It's original and it's pure. It stems from the roots of the land with all of its strength. That's what resistance is. It's a liberation movement that is real, that has independence, that has thought, that has ideals, that is of a perpetual nature and regenerates itself. So when we're talking about the Islamic resistance of Lebanon in 1982, it was formed directly in the year that Israel decided to reach the heart of Beirut. It didn't exist before that. It didn't even exist in 1978 when Israel did its limited invasion into Lebanon. And I would say that even before this resistance existed as like an official formation, you had decentralized forms of resistance that were being carried out against the occupation soldiers. So I believe the first attack against Israeli soldiers happened in Beirut in a really famous street called the Hamra Street. It was dubbed, I think it was called the Wimpy Operation. It was in the Motka Cafe. And it was carried out by a 19 or 20-year-old youth within the Syrian Social Nationalist Party. Again, that existed before the Islamic resistance of Lebanon was a thing. So the resistance in Lebanon was founded in 1982, the Islamic Republic of Iran was there to really help it materially form. But ultimately, this resistance wouldn't have formed if you didn't have indigenous Lebanese men on the ground who categorically rejected the presence of the occupation. It's not difficult to understand the reality, and the past 15 months has shown that. And that is that occupation, transgression, and aggression only births resistance. That is the formula. It's like the more you try to step on people's necks, the more they are likely to resist. So that was the reality. It formed in 1982 with the support of Iran, which is important to mention. Despite the Western-backed war that was waged by Saddam against Iran for a good 8 years, Iran at that time had good relations with Syria. And it's interesting to note that Hafez al-Assad at first, so Syria by that point had been in Lebanon, and Hafez at first wasn't too fond of this new resistance. He felt a kind of threat on Syria's influence within Lebanon. But then when he soon realized that really this group is just against the Israeli occupation and could actually help Syria in their fight against the common enemy, that's when he gave a lending hand. And actually Syria then became a very important corridor for Iran to support the resistance. So actually, the actions of the resistance movement on the ground were so strong that the Israeli occupation soldiers were forced to leave Beirut in 1982. And we have to understand that when Israel occupies a piece of land, they never anticipate in their wildest dreams that they'll have to withdraw. Their withdrawal is only as a result of being forced to unilaterally withdraw, because the reality is that Israel's expansion is in its nature. It will want to consolidate as much land as it possibly can, and the only thing that will stop it on its tracks and cause it to retreat is active confrontation and direct confrontation on the ground. And how do you know if that's effective or not? You can measure that by looking at whether Israel has managed to consolidate its presence on a piece of land that is occupied. So in 1982, it was actually forced to leave Lebanon, to leave Beirut in Lebanon, but it continued to occupy the country's southern half. But ultimately, those guerrilla attacks sustained casualties, and then they were forced to unilaterally withdraw from the south to the Awali River. This was in 1983. And then in 1985, they carried out phased withdrawals to a kind of security zone along the border. And the Lebanese guerrilla attacks increased, including the use of Katyusha rockets from back then, again, with the support of the Islamic Republic of Iran. And this continued until the liberation in 2000. Now, at this junction, it's worth mentioning that in February 1998, that is where you had Major General Qasem Soleimani, who was appointed as the head of the Quds Force by Ayatollah Khamenei, who's the current supreme leader of Iran. And essentially, this group is tasked with the extraterritorial operations that support resistance factions that are fighting against a common regional enemy. And it was here that Soleimani, who was quite active and energetic, he opened the Palestinian and the resistance files very quickly. And he led the coordination between the Quds Force and the Palestinian factions across the board in Gaza, including the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, the General Command, the Popular Resistance Committees. And so there was a kind of like synchronization and a coordinated strategy, and each faction wasn't acting separately, basically. And then in 1999, Soleimani arranged for the visitation of the founder of Hamas, Sheikh Ahmed Yassin, to Iran, where they discussed key milestones for like the next future phase. And so all of Soleimani's focus here was on how to strengthen the resistance capabilities and to help the resistance enter the phase of liberation. So the resistance operations continued to the point where it leaked to the public that Israel had intended to withdraw from Lebanon in 2000. And so the main discussion here centered on how Israel's withdrawal from South Lebanon could be transferred into Palestine itself. And so in September 2000, when Ariel Sharon stormed the Al-Aqsa Mosque, which led to widespread protests, that was almost like the moment that all the resistance factions were waiting for. And that is when they decided to basically develop this objective into an intifada and turn theory into tangible action. And that's when you had the second intifada, which was basically the spillover effect from South Lebanon into Palestine. And that ultimately led to the liberation of Gaza in 2005. That again, Gaza was similar to the West Bank back then, where it was liberated in the sense that the Israelis were kicked out and Gaza could build itself ultimately. So that was all the effect of the resistance. Until today, you see how Lebanon and Palestine are essentially brothers in arms when it comes to this resistance. You know, the resistance in Lebanon helps Palestine because they're effectively both liberation movements rooted in the soil, because Lebanon itself knows what the Israeli occupation in Lebanon was like, and they know that there's no worse occupation that humanity has witnessed than what is happening in Palestine. The same enemy that is occupying Palestine has occupied Lebanon, and this enemy knows no limits to its expansionism. And so Israel remains this kind of persistent threat on not just Lebanon, but the whole region, according to their own admission, where they speak of this idea of a quote unquote new Middle East. So in Syria, because there was no active opposition to Israel, you saw how they just entered and were able to occupy and were kind of given the free hand to do that. And where Israel sees a kind of weakness, it will take advantage of that unless the resistance is strong. That is the only case in which you won't see the occupation expand. In actual fact, you'll see it backtrack. So Lebanon's experience has shown that only resistance can stop the occupation, nothing else. Otherwise, the situation today would have literally been like Beirut in 1982 if the resistance did not stop Israel on its tracks in those 66 days. It would have reached Beirut and it would have drawn out new maps, ultimately.
So that's a fantastic kind of resume of Lebanon and its recent history and what the people have gone through, how it came about. I suppose my takeaway from what you've said so far is that perhaps Hamas, Fatah, the PLO, Islamic Jihad, the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine wouldn't exist if you didn't have the Zionist state's occupation of Palestine. And then by extension, we could say Hezbollah would not exist if it wasn't for the expansionist Zionist state's occupation of Lebanon. So it appears like that all the wars, all the destruction of the civil infrastructure, human lives, human hopes, human dreams, the future that people had hoped for their children has all been destroyed because a white European colonial settler footprint has been placed in the middle of the Levant to divide the Ummah, and Israel, with its greater Israel expansionist state policy, is intent on taking parts of the Sinai, Jordan, all of Lebanon, parts of Syria, and even parts of Saudi Arabia as the greater Zionist, greater Israel project. So we could talk all night. We could probably talk all the way through to tomorrow. It's such an interesting topic. But maybe we'll just jump forward to the election of President Aoun. I just want to touch on the French and the Saudis and the Qataris, the Israelis and the Americans all pushed for the 60-day ceasefire. And then as part of that, they wanted presidential elections so that there wasn't a vacuum in Lebanon. And it reminds me very much of what they said in 2005, 2006. They said that they didn't have a Palestinian negotiator to sit down with. They wanted the Palestinians to speak with one voice. So they wanted democratic elections in the West Bank, the occupied territories, and in what had then just been liberated Gaza. They wanted Fatah to become, and the Palestinian Authority as such, to become the voices of the Palestinian people. Not because they were going to be advocating on behalf of the Palestinians, but because they were malleable, I would argue that they were a bought entity and that they actually survive today as Israeli Zionist police in the West Bank, controlling the resistance and acting as Israel's collaborators and Israel's police force in Palestine, wearing Palestinian uniforms. So my question is, when all these outside agitators have pushed for the election of a president in Lebanon, why do they want a president in Lebanon? Who's been elected? Why was he elected? What do you think his role will be going forward? And more importantly, do you think the people that pushed for the election, like they did in Palestine in 2005, 2006, and when the people voted for Hamas, they said, oh, no, 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 no. It might be a democratic election, but you voted for the wrong people. So we're not going to accept the democratic plebiscite as put forward by the people of Palestine who elected Hamas as their democratic leaders. What does this presidency and indeed the election of the Prime Minister mean for Lebanon, in your view, going forward? What are the pluses? What are the minuses? And what do you think are the potential traps being set for Lebanon going forward?
Right, so lots to unpack there. But I think we can start off with the question of why is there an election for presidency in Lebanon right now? It's exactly as you mentioned, why is America pushing for that right now? So, of course, after the fall of Syria, America has now decided to come and to reinforce and to strengthen its position and to garner the consensus of the Lebanese MPs, taking advantage of the fact that post-war, many unstable MPs that are prone to changing their positions feel that the resistance is weaker and are content with turning their allegiance to America. So they feel the resistance is weaker after the 66-day confrontation, in which you had most notoriously the pager attacks and the killing of the front and second line commanders within the resistance movement. So it's easier now, you could say, for America to come and to secure the number of MPs that they weren't able to get before. So the reason for this vacuum for the past 2 years is because, as we mentioned, there is a kind of confessional sectarian system in Lebanon where the president has to be a Maronite Christian. Now you've got two main Lebanese Christian parties. You've got the Free Patriotic Movement that is aligned with the resistance, and you have the Lebanese Forces, which is led by Samir Jaja, who's a gangster-like pro-Israel figure within the country, who's very unstable and very extreme as well. And those two have not agreed on the president that they want elected. And you have to have 65 MPs agreeing out of the 128 MPs for a president to be voted, and no agreement has been reached. Now America feels like it's in a position where it can pressure the MPs in this situation where it feels like it scored points. And ultimately what's happened has actually broken the law in some respects, because a civil servant is not actually allowed to be in a position of presidency. So you asked who On is. He's actually the fifth army chief to be elected as president. In 2017, he actually became a commander of the Lebanese armed forces. But there's a kind of procedure in which you have to follow. So you have to resign from your position as part of the Lebanese armed forces. You have to have not worked, I think it is, for at least 6 months before you put yourself forward as a candidate. So due to the obstacles in this situation that we find ourselves in this unprecedented situation, the only way that they could overturn, because of course they couldn't change the legislation itself to reverse that, because you would need the support of a president, and there's no president in Lebanon. So the only way that they can overturn that, as per the constitution, is if you get 86 votes that agree on a president that doesn't meet the requirement. So in terms of President On, he actually fell short of those 86 votes that he needed in the first round, but he crossed the threshold with 99 votes in the second round after the Islamic Resistance of Lebanon, and the Amal Party, which is allied with it, decided that they wanted to back him. So this is interesting that they all know, all parties know, that the one that is brought to position of power has to be accepted by the resistance. They cannot bring someone like Samir Jarjah that I've mentioned from the Lebanese forces to power, because there's no way the resistance or the Amal Party would accept him. But also it's important to mention that America itself wants some kind of quote unquote stability right now in the situation in Lebanon. That's why they brought someone like on. But ultimately, America is in a position right now where it's easier for them to secure the number of MPs that they weren't able to get before. So as we know, the region right now is in a kind of tension phase. We know that Trump, if we want to analyze his personality, he's not pro-conventional wars. He sought an end to it, the war in Gaza. And he wants the situation to be more settled. So I think the pros of having a president is Lebanon becomes more stabilized. You have more compromises that can walk, more deals that could be struck with Lebanon. That's better for the collective Lebanese people. But ultimately, in all of this, America considers that they've won in Lebanon. They consider the resistance to be weaker. They consider it to have less influence on the political decision making in Lebanon. And so, if we were to look at it in terms of point success, maybe America gets a point here because Aoun is someone who, as we've mentioned, is America's man, despite the fact that he is deeply popular within Lebanon. Also, in no small part because in 2017, he became the commander of the Lebanese armed forces, where he led an army in the fight against ISIS along the Syrian border. So that's important to mention. But what the Islamic Resistance of Lebanon wouldn't have accepted pre the war, it has to now accept. And the Lebanese resistance doesn't see it in its best interest to act as an obstacle in the way of Lebanon's stability with the coming of a new president. The Lebanese resistance previously rejected Aoun, who's America's main man, as we've been mentioning, for the candidate that supports the resistance, that's Sleiman Frangieh. So what's the difference between an American man like Aoun and Frangieh, who's supported by the resistance? General Aoun is someone who now President Aoun is someone who would believe that the state should have monopoly over all arms. So this idea that there shouldn't be an independent resistance that has its own arms. But of course, as we know, if we're talking about the disarmament of the resistance, we're talking about Lebanon having no way of preventing the reoccupation of Israel, because the only thing that prevented the reoccupation of Israel was the blood of the resistance. And despite Israel's hits, it wasn't able to penetrate. And this is something that no one can ignore. No one can ignore these facts, including the new president. And of course, America knows this very well. One of the strongest cards to protect Lebanon is the resistance. And we know that America has actually bought the Lebanese army. So America is the one that funds and finances the Lebanese army to tame them. The Lebanese army is also not equipped to fight Israel. It doesn't have the technology, the weaponry, the long-range missiles to do that. Anything that it can possibly use against Israel, it doesn't have on purpose. But if we just come back to the question of, Aoun coming to power, if Israel resoundingly won the war against Lebanon, which of course it hasn't, but if it did, we would have likely seen the man that I mentioned, Samir Jarjah, the head of the Lebanese forces, in power, similar to the man that I mentioned previously, Bashir Gemayel, who was also the head of the Lebanese forces, who came to power when Israel occupied Beirut in 1982. He was Israel's main man that they put. But of course, America cannot bring someone like Jarjah to power because the power balance is not strictly in their favor to that extent. If the Lebanese resistance resoundingly won, the reality would have likely imposed someone like Frangieh, who was the preferable candidate of the resistance. He hails from the Marada party. But this comes ultimately to the question of, can America impose something on the resistance that the resistance doesn't accept? And the answer to this question is no. Why? Because internally, the resistance is still strong. We know Israel could have reached Beirut, but nothing can ultimately be imposed on the resistance because it won on the ground. And we know that the American line in Lebanon has been coexisting with the resistance line for the past 2 decades. Why? Because the resistance simply imposes itself. It doesn't seek the permission of the state. It doesn't seek the permission of America. And its speciality is in its ability to adapt to things. And so will this make a big difference for the Lebanese resistance in terms of who comes to power as president? I don't think so. No. Why? Because the reality of the battlefield is what imposes itself. If the resistance if the resistance is strong and achieving results, then it cannot be overtaken, whether there is a president or not. If the president is, if the resistance is weak and America wants to create a kind of sedition within Lebanon, then America will mobilize the opposing sides it feels like can harm the resistance. But the key fact here is that the resistance wasn't broken or defeated. And within 66 days, the occupation forces couldn't meaningfully penetrate. And that explains why today we see it seeking revenge for its failures in the south through this continuous ceasefire transgressions. But that is not an achievement of any kind. Rather, it's due to their lack of achievement that it is resorting to such measures during the 66-day period. So we need to view these transgressions as a kind of revenge of Israel not being able to achieve any of its goals. Now, you asked a question also about the new PM in Lebanon. His name is Nawaf Salam, who is the former ICJ president. So, yes, he is America's man, but I would say that he's arguably preferable to Najib Mikati, who is the former PM, because Mikati is someone who comes to Lebanon with the votes of the resistance. So bear in mind that Nawaf Salam was not voted by the resistance, but Mikati is someone who came in with the votes of the resistance, and he sees himself as kind of above them, even trying to disassociate from them. He tries to present white cards to America at the expense of the people who literally voted for him. And I'll never forget how Najib Mikati was the man who refused to accept support from the Islamic Republic of Iran to rebuild and to reconstruct the destroyed parts of Lebanon. And that can be explained by the fact that he's got millions and millions of dollars in Western banks abroad, and he doesn't want to upset his Western masters. So at least someone like Nawaf Salam is exposed, and because America bought him and he hasn't been approved by the resistance, there is potentiality that he could even seek closeness to the resistance. So he appears more diplomatic than Mikati. But if we just want to summarize the situation of the resistance in Lebanon, will it allow Israel to go back in post 60 days? Definitely not. Will Israel try and seek a war with Lebanon again? I don't think so, because Lebanon has been tried and tested battleground. And if they were able to win on the ground, and if they were able to advance and achieve anything, then Israel wouldn't stop. Israel wouldn't stop if it's able to continue going, but it's because it was resoundingly losing that it had to stop. So I think the resistance likely sees an opportunity during the next 4 years under Trump to strengthen itself, to seek to close all its gaps, to maintain itself, to recuperate for the next confrontation. And as long as the resistance remains steadfast and its spirit is there, as we know, the Al-Aqsa flood signifies a phase in the chapter of the region's liberation from Western hegemony. But I think the more the Lebanese resistance responds to any aggression from Israel post the 60-day ceasefire, because these 60 days are there for for Israel to basically withdraw. It's a 60-day period for it to withdraw. So post 60 days, we should expect complete calm and Israel to not transgress. But obviously, given Israel is Israel, you also expect it to transgress and to break the boundaries. So I think the more the Lebanese resistance responds to that aggression, the more it would be able to consolidate its stability, because Israel only understands the language of force.
Yes, I agree with you. I've always thought the strength of Hezbollah, which was Hassan Nasrallah, peace be upon him, was that every time the Israelis attacked, there would be an immediate response. So the Israelis know before they cross the border, before they fly a drone, before they drop a bomb, that there's going to be a reaction, and an immediate reaction, and it makes them think twice before they attack Lebanon. Now, we've only got a few minutes left. I want to tie two things in together just to see if it makes sense. My concern as an outsider for Lebanon around President Aoun and the Lebanese army is they wanted to remove the resistance from southern Lebanon. They wanted to replace them with a paper tiger army, which is the Lebanese army. They are funded by the Americans. It's old ex-surplus American ammunition and light armaments that they have. They don't have an air force. They have some helicopters as their aerial defense. They don't really have any tanks. There's 70,000 volunteers. They are ranked 118 out of 125 armed countries. Their budget for this year, I believe, is 985 million, whereas Israel's budget is $20.4 billion. Obviously, nearly all of it from America. So America is sending $100 million. They're diverting it from Egypt's bought and paid for generals, and they're sending it to Lebanon. Now, that money will not put the Lebanese army in any form or position to defend Lebanese sovereignty, which they claim is what they're going to do. So I'm wondering, is that 100 million in order to strengthen the Lebanese army for internal military operations, potentially in conflict with the resistance going forward? Because the empire never sleeps. They're not looking at 1 year or 2 years or 5 years or 10 years. They're looking 20 years down the line. You've already stated that the president of Lebanon believes that the Lebanese army is the only justifiable and legitimate armed group in the country, and everyone else should disarm and leave it to the Lebanese army, when we all know they are not capable of securing the border and protecting the Lebanese people. And on securing the border, just briefly, Syria is now balkanized. It's now in three parts. It's got Israel with 1/3, the Kurds and the Turks and the Americans with another third, and these terrorists who have seized power, 60% or more, are not even Syrians. They are paid mercenaries from Uyghurs from China, people from Uzbekistan, people from Georgia, people from Ukraine. I read reports that weapons are being smuggled over the border from Syria, I believe, to elements potentially of the Muslim Brotherhood. And Julani and his terrorist cohorts have said their enemy is Hezbollah and their enemy is the Iranian people, and they are friends of Israel. So what is the potential threat going forward of the Lebanese army in Lebanon? Do you think it's genuinely going to protect the people of Lebanon and not become entangled with the resistance? And will Julani and his cutthroating band of murderers be used to target southern Lebanon in a second front, or potentially Iran in the second front on behalf of Israel and the United States?
Right. So I'll say that the situation hasn't changed much from what it has been in the past 4 decades, in the sense that the Lebanese army has always existed, and the Islamic resistance of Lebanon was born out of the fact that the Lebanese army was not resisting the Israeli occupation. And despite the fact that the American line has existed within Lebanon also for decades. So when we talk about Resolution 1701, which the crux of it is to basically push the resistance back from the Litani River and to disarm the resistance, and to ensure that the state has full monopolization over the arms, which basically means that the state is not allowed to defend itself and its sovereignty, and there's no concept of sovereignty. This resolution has existed since 2006, so we're entering the 19th the literal 19th year of that resolution. And so what does that tell us? The fact that we've seen the resistance capabilities grow from 2006 until now exponentially, it tells us that the resistance doesn't really answer to these kinds of resolutions. It doesn't answer to America. It doesn't answer to the Lebanese army, which is designed in a way in which, as I've mentioned, it's not impartial or cares about the interests of Lebanon in the sense that it's funded by America. It's being used by America to carry out their dirty work in the same way that the PA would be used to carry out the dirty work of Israel in targeting the Palestinian resistance fighters in places like the West Bank. Likewise, the Lebanese army is now tasked with overseeing the implementation of Resolution 1701, which means hatching out the depots for the resistance arms, for example. But as we know, suppose the resistance decided that it wants to withdraw back from the Litani River over the ground, we know that the resistance actually operates under the ground, and its capabilities will continue to expand, and it will continue to close its gaps and to maintain itself and to recuperate. So that resolution has always existed. In spite of that resolution, the resistance imposes itself on the ground. It imposes itself on the ground, and it is not answerable because it is ultimately rooted in the will of the indigenous people who want to be liberated from this hegemonic occupation and know that there is no sense of real liberation as long as Israel exists. Lebanon will continue to be threatened. And the biggest proof of that is these past 15 months in which we saw Israel rapidly move into Lebanon on the 23rd of September, like a rabid dog, essentially, escalating its aggressions. You hear of Israel talking about this idea of a quote unquote new Middle East and taking out one country and then moving into the other. So if anything, these past 15 months has only vindicated the idea and the concept of resistance and has made it more firmly rooted within the general Lebanese masses. So even those who might have previously not supported the resistance or had this idea of like, oh, the resistance is the reason that we have economic sieges and sanctions on our country and inflation is so high because the resistance has decided to decouple from the state and not hand over its weaponry to the state. These same people now realize that actually the independence of the resistance is important, because what else is able to defend us and ensure that Israeli tanks don't reach Beirut? Israeli tanks would have been right now in Beirut. We would have been in a situation like 1982 if the resistance arms were not there to defend the country. So that's the crux over here that I would say, is that the resistance imposes itself on the ground, and as long as it's strong on the ground, it cannot and will not be overtaken politically. It's the military situation that dictates the political of anything, not the political that dictates the military. So as I mentioned, if the resistance resoundingly won on the ground, you would have even had the pro-resistance candidate potentially in presidency. And if Israel resoundingly won, you would have had a situation like 1982, where Bashir Ismail, who was the former Aleph leader, would have been in a position of power. So ultimately, it's the power balance dictated by what happens on the ground. And what is the reality on the ground dictated by? It's dictated by the will of the people to rise up and to resist. And the make or break factor here is the morale. If Israel wasn't able to reoccupy Lebanon, to enter Lebanon and to consolidate any square inch on the ground, it is because their army are too cowards and they're too scared to fight. And they're too scared of falling into ambushes and getting killed, and that they were sustaining lots of losses. And that's what ultimately led the confrontation to end after 66 days, with Israel having achieved its stated goal of ultimately reoccupying Lebanon and disarming or dismantling the resistance. They're ultimately back to square one, and they've secured real losses. And on the question of Syria, again, the resistance in Lebanon won't be dragged into a sectarian war. And I think that's something that they're very, very aware of. Does the threat loom of essentially Israel and America using these terrorist rebels to go into Lebanon, to besiege Lebanon ultimately from one side? That was the whole point. It's like when Israel failed on the Lebanese front, they activated the Syrian front, they got all of their rebels, released them out en masse, dismantled the existing Syrian government. And had Israel won on the ground in Lebanon, then you would have had a besiegement of Lebanon from both sides. It would have come from the Israeli occupation entity, and it would have also come from the Syrian rebels. But I think actually with the situation under Trump, that makes it slightly less likely, because Trump is the kind of guy that isn't really a proponent of American involvement in the wars in the region. In his mind, Syria is basically somewhere that America shouldn't really have much involvement in. So I think that strategy of using Syria to kind of get to Lebanon would be less likely now than if you had Democrats in positions of power. But Syrian involvement could be on the level of, for example, creating sectarian sedition, building up from the previous war where the Lebanese resistance was involved against those factions in Syria now. I think the presence of Syrians potentially in certain areas in Lebanon under the control of the resistance, you might have members of the resistance there being demanded by the new Syrian government. That's probably just some ways in which the involvement of Syria in Lebanon can happen. There's the ability to mobilize sectarianism within Lebanon, I think especially through the Sunni population, many who support the new situation in Syria. And I think the objective of all of this is to keep the Lebanese resistance preoccupied. But will this be successful? Most likely not. Will this happen? Most likely not either, because I think the resistance in Lebanon is very aware. And as I've mentioned, it's put on the side of the sectarian war. Lebanon did not get dragged into it despite its involvement in Syria during the first war. And I think especially after the Al-Aqsa flood, sectarianism has gone down a lot prior to what it was 10, 15 years ago. And at the same time, we don't expect stability in Syria because you have all of these factions that are contradictory. So if the differences in the contradictions internally spread and chaos spreads within Syria, then they start to fight their own battles. So the Kurds and the Turks and then ISIS turning against them. So it becomes very complicated in that situation, and there doesn't become a kind of like clear-cut strategy. It's like they get lost amongst themselves, so to speak, within that infighting. So America's shooting itself in the foot by creating a very contradictory, unstable situation. And as we know, opportunities also exist in crisis to develop in other ways that the resistance will be thinking about and hatching out, especially during these next 4 years under Trump. I think that would be decisive.
Well, thank you very much. That's our time up. I'd like to thank you again, Batool, Subeti, activist and political analyst, for joining us tonight. Really enjoyed the conversation. Hope we can chat again sometime soon if there's new developments or new things on the ground. So until then, we obviously hope that the ceasefire holds in Gaza and that there's peace in whatever form in Syria and in Lebanon. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much for having me. Thank you. Take care.